Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next moderated panel. This one's titled Leadership and Humanitarian Futures. And we have a really exciting lineup of panelists here to speak with you. I would say this is really releasing some groundbreaking research that's been done for our first session. So without further ado, I won't waste a lot of time with you all hearing my voice, but I will introduce a bit about each of these speakers. So basically this paper you'll have seen on the website, I'm sure that's why you signed up. It's reporting on an ongoing survey into the perceptions of senior INGO leaders on the future of the aid and development sector. I think this is really exciting work. And so I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel. We'll first start out with Gareth. Gareth Owen spent the last 30 years working in the aid sector. He joined Save the Children UK in 2002 as an emergency advisor, and looks like became Humanitarian Director very quickly in 2007. So that sounds like an interesting story in itself. Gareth has led responses to many major emergencies over the past 2 decades, most notably the Iraq conflict, the Asian tsunami, Cyclone Nargis, Haiti, Pakistan, East Africa, Niger, and the Philippines. He played a pivotal role in the development of Save the Children's humanitarian capacity and in the establishment of collaborative hosted entities, including ELRA, the START Network, and the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. He was awarded an OBE in the 2013 Queen's Birthday Honors List for services to emergency crisis response abroad. Our next guest is Melanie Book, and she is the Humanitarian Foresight and Policy Analyst at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. I get to work with Melanie almost every day, which is really a treat. She joined the humanitarian sector in 2010, responding to emergencies throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Most recently, she has played roles in Save the Children's response to the Rohingya crisis, the Syria crisis, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. She has a background in law and policy. She worked on law reform projects at state government level and as a lawyer in the commercial sector. She's also worked quite a lot for asylum seekers in Australia. She's got a Bachelor of Arts and Law from University of Western Australia, a Master of Development Studies from University of Melbourne, and a grad cert of Humanitarian Leadership, our very own program here at Deakin University. And Max Biden is the Humanitarian Innovation and Collaboration Advisor at Save the Children UK. He brings systems thinking approaches to complex social problems through his work in humanitarian policy and with networks and startups. He's the work stream lead for the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network. And it sounds like he spent 3 months setting up that network in Ethiopia, which is really impressive. He's provided strategic and operational support to ELRA and the START Network. So very excited to have the 3 of you here. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Melanie to start her presentation.
If I could just jump in, can I just jump in to start? Sorry about that, Mariana. I was going to just do a quick intro for that, if that's okay. Sorry, Melanie, let me say a couple of words, if that's okay. Firstly, thank you to you and thank you to CHL for allowing us to showcase what is an emerging, exciting piece of work. The survey we're going to show you it's part of a wider project, and this is the first stage, which will we hope will become an influential collaborative policy research project stretching over the next few years, actually. We want to aim to shake up leadership thinking in humanitarian civil society and stimulate debate for change, and hopefully develop some policy recommendations aiming at various governments in due course. So this is a collaboration between practitioners like ourselves and some fairly heavyweight academics in the UK and elsewhere in the world. Professors Aaronson and Thompson have long associations with the humanitarian world, and Nuffield College at Oxford University has a very significant alumni of world leaders. So this project really is of its time. I mean, even before the pandemic, INGOs were asking themselves pretty hard questions about their future role and purpose. We're all aware of the various critiques and debates. And so, especially here in the UK, but elsewhere in the world, fighting to regain public trust after a growing swell of scandal and criticism that has brought into question the legitimacy of international NGOs in a changing world. But in the busy sort of doingness of aid, there's very little space for serious critical reflection within big agencies like the one I work for, which is why conferences like this are so important and the work of CHL is so vital. So hence this project is really linking serious academia and major practitioners, past, present, and future, to start a process of critical reflection and hopefully reimagination of our role in the aid sector. So we set out to better understand the leadership mindset as it exists today, the lived reality of leaders, and the challenges they live with every day. But despite the obvious limitations of focusing on a group of international NGOs, northern based, and even more limited in the sense that a lot of them are based in the UK, that we recognise that's a useful starting point for gaining a deeper understanding of the sector at large. And one of the reasons to do that here in the UK is that we're facing radical uncertainty. COVID has not only destabilised operations, but it's added a whole level of further uncertainty about the future. So that's really what we're about here. There's a very senior panel of figures helping this project, and I think it's fair to say, and I'll hand over to Mel straight away, we've been quite blown away by the number of CEOs who wanted to have their say for an hour, and that's allowed us to draw some really interesting sort of initial quantitative and qualitative sort of conclusions, which Melanie's going to walk us through now. So over to you, Mel. Sorry for that.
Great, thank you very much, Gareth. So perhaps just before we get into a bit more about the details of the survey, one of these sort of key elements that came out of some of the preliminary work done in this project was a set of scenarios that was really looking at describing the possible futures of the role of INGOs in the next decade. The key variables in the scenarios that are sort of represented here, you can see on the two axes. One is the extent to which INGOs can adapt and change their ways of operating, and the other is their sort of relative degree of importance to aid and development activities. Scenarios A and B reflect a lower degree of adaptation by INGOs. Scenario A reflects essentially a status quo, but scenario B reflects a scenario where a lack of adaptation and change by INGOs effectively sees them almost ubered out of existence as dynamics change and other actors come to the fore. Scenarios C and D both envisage INGOs being more highly adaptive and making significant changes in the ways that they operate. Scenario C sees this INGOs retaining quite a significant degree of influence in the sector. Scenario D recognises that while INGOs may adapt and change, they'll be a relevant but perhaps less dominant actor in a more diversified aid system. So we had this sort of set of scenarios as a bit of a framework. We were really interested to see whether these scenarios resonated with leaders, and also to get a sense of where in these scenarios we might be sitting in our discussions with INGO leaders, and we'll come back to the scenarios a little bit later on. But to talk to the survey that we've conducted, my colleagues and I were fortunate to speak with around 50 CEOs and senior leaders within INGOs. The purpose of the survey was really to unpack their lived experiences, as Gareth pointed out. And while we focused on a number of the sort of larger traditional organisations, that's certainly not to necessarily privilege their voice or exclude others, but rather reflect the sort of current dynamics and their incumbency within the current system. We adopted a semi-structured interview approach, so typically a discussion for an hour, which allowed us to cover key themes, but also other themes to emerge over the course of the discussion. So in this presentation, we've begun our preliminary analysis of the data, and in this presentation, we offer our initial observations and impressions. We anticipate that these will develop as we delve deeper into what is really a very rich data set. But we take this opportunity to share our initial impressions and also to seek your feedback and your initial impressions as to what is particularly interesting to you and what you might like to know more about as we kind of go through the analysis and formulate a report to present all the key findings. But to take you through sort of the initial findings of the survey. So our initial question to our participants was to identify the 3 most influential factors that would shape the aid and development sector to 2030. And you'll see that really the most commonly identified factor by quite some way was money. And the second was donors, and obviously there's a connection there. Localisation, the impacts of climate change and technological change were also very commonly identified factors, along with shifting global geopolitics, local governments, and the role of national civil society actors. We then asked participants, in light of these factors, what this would mean for humanitarian need and agencies. to describe their vision of the aid and development sector by 2030. The most common emerging theme was a shift in power dynamics by 2030, whether that was a more localised system, a more diversified one, or a more networked one. You'll see here some keywords like equitable distribution of power, locally owned, locally positioned, globally connected, INGOs occupying a useful place, but a more humbler and less dominant place. And many of these reflections were sort of according with scenarios C and D that I mentioned a little earlier. So after this initial sort of understanding contextual elements and visioning, we asked participants some questions more around specifically localisation, financing, organisational change, leadership, and some further questions about the impacts of COVID and Black Lives Matter. To go through some of the key reflections from those discussions. Certainly, money, donors, risk and compliance do dominate the landscape in many respects for CEOs. We saw this quite clearly in terms of the contextual factors that INGO leaders pointed to. But this was also quite a common theme when we discussed barriers to change, whether that be in relation to localisation or changes in INGO operating models. Our reflections from discussions with CEOs was that they feel quite almost in the middle between the sort of strict compliance requirements from donors and then trying to operate more with local actors, but those local actors perhaps not having the organisational infrastructure to manage those heavy compliance requirements. And so we see a tension emerging between some of the initiatives referred to in the Grand Bargain and this sort of increasing compliance focus. But interestingly, while money and donors were cited as being very influential and in some cases a barrier to change, there was perhaps a degree of resignation about the extent to which shifts away from traditional sources of funding were possible. While some saw potential growth from other sources like high net worth individuals, the private sector or emerging non-traditional donors, there was a limited belief that this would really thoroughly replace current funding mechanisms. Having said that, we did also have a number of interesting discussions around organisations that were increasingly saying no to certain types of financing in favour of a more values-driven approach. And INGOs that were looking at different business models, whether they be around a sort of nominal fee for service, impact investment, or different shifts in partnership models. So I think a sense of the challenges of adapting such, in many cases, very large global organisations, particularly those in federated structures, but also some examples of where things were being, serious discussions were underway about how these things might shift and change. Another key area that we focused on was localisation, and what became quite clear here was that there was really no collective understanding of what localisation really means in the humanitarian sector. Participants variously referred to localisation as more local leadership and power sharing within their own federated organisational structures. Others saw it as a greater focus on partnerships with local civil society. Others saw it more as a retreat from service delivery and a real re-evaluation of the value add that INGOs can offer. Barriers to localisation were often cited as sort of risk and compliance issue, that sort of risk sandwich, as it were, where INGOs are feeling sort of a bit stuck in between the requirements of donors and operating with local actors. The capacity of local actors was also something that was identified as a potential barrier, and something that I think was viewed as a bit of an elephant in the room about the extent to which and the various contexts in which local capacity existed and the extent to which that facilitated the localisation discussion. In terms of our discussion around localisation and legitimacy, one thing that also became apparent was that leaders were really keen to see sort of quite a nuanced discussion around what legitimacy means in the sector, and keen to point out that while international actors may not necessarily be the most legitimate, equally local does not necessarily equal legitimate, and that if local actors may be viewed as legitimate with a significant degree of trust, from some communities may not necessarily mean that they're best placed to respond in all circumstances. So really looking at a kind of a bit more of a nuanced understanding of what legitimacy means to whom and in what particular context. In discussing the relevance of Black Lives Matter and decolonisation, it really became clear that the perceived relevance of this shifted quite a lot, both within organisations and across organisations. There was certainly an identification of Black Lives Matter as meaning a significant focus on diversity and inclusion, but that it wasn't necessarily understood equally between, say, US and UK-based staff versus how this discussion was being interpreted in regional or country offices. Similarly, we found that the discussion resonated more with leaders of dual mandate UK and US-based agencies than perhaps the single mandate humanitarian agencies. While diversity and inclusion was clearly identified as flowing on from the Black Lives Matter movement, the connection to that and more substantive change around decolonising aid was really quite varied. There was certainly, though, a recognition that current leadership lacked diversity and a lot of initiatives to try to address this, and we really had the impression of a strong sense of humility and focus on inclusion in addressing this. As with Black Lives Matter, the current changes from COVID, the perceptions there were really quite varied. There was a lot of discussion around the impact that it had from the perspective of ways of working, and this is a prime example of operating a lot more remotely, but certainly I think less consensus around the extent to which it really reflected a very fundamental change in the system. Another key area that emerged was the role of boards, and what really struck us was how significant it was in the discussions or in the sort of lives of CEOs, and how little we really talk about it more widely in the sector. So a lot of interesting discussions acknowledging the good intentions and contributions of board members, but also unpacking the sort of the necessary risk and compliance skill set that comes with being a board member, and the extent to which that is really compatible and best suited to navigating organisational change in a complex environment. In terms of the role of affected communities, this was something where we sensed certainly a lot of genuine intent, but perhaps a lack of really a clear pathway forward in how transformational change could really come about in terms of centering the role of affected communities in humanitarian response. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of our key reflections. In terms of what's next, a much more detailed analysis of the rich data set, and certainly we're looking to share a report that will go into a lot more detail on many of these issues in the coming months. But of course, as I mentioned, we are keen to use this opportunity to get your initial feedback and any reactions. What might be surprising here? What's less surprising? Are there particular areas that you'd be interested to hear more about? And that will really help us as we sort of shape our analysis and hopefully make this a really sort of interesting and useful piece for organisations and the sector more generally. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there.